Hi, my name is Carrot. I've always been an adventurer at heart. I've been all sorts of places, from the frozen taiga to the burning nether, and I've seen some amazing things. On my travels, I've had some pretty wild encounters, and I've rescued dozens of animals. Last year, my favorite uncle passed away and left me a literal ton of emeralds. So, I bought myself a zoo, and I made a home for all my rescued friends. These are their stories. The one about the crocodile. Some days are more memorable than others for a variety of reasons. But the day I rescued Eric, now that was a day I will never forget. I'd been busy all day rushing from one place to the next. My phone had been ringing incessantly for the last 30 minutes, so despite my time crunch, I finally decided to stop and take the call. Hello? I said into the phone, the annoyance of the day obvious in my tone. Ew, sorry, Carrot Love, but we've got a big problem and we need your help. It was one of my dearest adventuring friends in the South, Mick, owner of the best croc rescue this side of the Nether portal. What's up? I asked, forgetting my annoyance at the sound of worry in his voice. He's back, he said. Time stopped momentarily. I knew exactly what he was talking about. A few years prior, I'd flown south to help Mick with the troublesome croc we called Brutus, and what a brute he was. At the time, he was going around digging up the nests of the females he hadn't mated with and leaving his own broods untouched. He was a mean old bastard and one of the biggest crocs I'd ever seen. Back then, we'd managed to trank him and drag him off to another river a few miles away, but not before he'd destroyed nearly all the nests in the area. All but one, in fact. That brute hatched and grew and was pretty much as expected, except for one little fella who stuck out like a sore thumb, a tiny little thing with the palest of scales. Mick kept the brood safe, and eventually they all grew up into a thriving adulthood, the little albino who we dubbed Eric with an A among them. So, when Mick said he was back, I knew he was talking about none other than the notorious Brutus. He's back, and he's bigger and meaner than ever, he was saying in my ear. I've got the guys working overtime keeping watch, but we've had some losses. And Carrot, we can't find Eric. I didn't hesitate a moment longer. I dropped what I was doing and headed south that very moment. I met up with Mick the next morning at a small dock on the river where Eric usually spent his time. There was no sign of Eric anywhere. Not like he blended in. Usually, the crocs are tagged with special GPS monitors, but once in a while the devices go silent. Under normal circumstances, that wouldn't be an issue, but considering the danger the smaller males were in, it was very inconvenient. We trolled along the shore slowly, looking for any sign of Eric, good, bad, or ugly, and after about 4 hours, we finally found him, basking on a muddy bank much further from the sanctuary than we'd ever seen him. I hadn't seen him since he was a little guy, but he was a magnificent beast. His white scales glinted in the afternoon sun as if he were coated in a layer of diamond dust. He was nearly 3 meters long, but he looked small compared to the other crocs in the area. That thought made me shudder. How massive had Brutus grown if Eric looked small? We approached him slowly, cooing at him as I always had. Our plan was to lure him into the cage hanging from the side of the boat, as had been done many times before. But just as he was easing his way into the water, we heard a splash behind us. It was Brutus, and he was here to claim this territory. He lunged toward the small boat and clamped his jaws around the cage and dove under the stern. The boat tilted violently, and Mick slammed the blade of his massive hunting knife into the rope that supported the cage. The boat shot back upright, and a layer of water half an inch deep covered the bottom. The cage vanished beneath the surface of the muddy river. We knew we weren't safe yet, and Eric had vanished. Mick grabbed the oars, because obviously we couldn't run the outboard with Eric out of sight, and as he plunged the first oar into the water, massive jaws snapped it in half, yanking the broken spear-like remains from Mick's hands. Brutus wasn't playing with us. He was going to kill us. We had no choice but to fight back. I grabbed the tranquilizer gun and aimed it at the muddy surface of the river. It seemed so calm, so peaceful. Nearly impossible to believe that just below the surface there was a nightmare waiting to take revenge from years past. It made no sense to shoot blindly. I would just waste hundreds of dollars of croc trank, so I kept the trank gun pointed at the water and skimmed the banks up and down on both sides for any sign of Eric. I didn't want him getting into a scuffle with Brutus. He was far too beautiful for that. He should remain as flawless and incredible as he had always been. We needed to take him somewhere safer. Suddenly, Brutus lunged out of the water, slamming himself against the side of the boat as if he'd been trying to get in. The boat rocked violently. Mick and I, both completely taken by surprise, were thrown into the murky depths of what would surely be a watery grave. Then, out of the muddy darkness, in an image of mercy and grace, Eric was there, pushing us to the surface, giving us the boost we needed to escape the thrashing whip of Brutus's massive tail. We grabbed the side of the boat and pulled ourselves to safety just in time to see Brutus grab Eric by the tail and yank him below the surface of the water. It took only seconds to lose sight of the crocs and for the river to return to looking as peaceful as it always had. Terror rose in my throat as I held my breath, waiting for any sign at all that Eric would survive. Minutes passed before Mick said quietly, "We need to start the engine now, Carrot. We need to report the loss." I nodded sadly, certain the world had just lost one of its most beautiful creatures. Mick yanked the pull string of the outboard and it roared to life for half a second before dying with a squeal and a crunch. "That didn't sound good," he said, tilting the motor up to see if the blade was damaged. It was destroyed. Somehow, when Brutus had dove under the boat with the cage, he'd gotten it caught on the blades, and when we started the engine, they spun around, gotten completely caught, and were now a shattered mess. "That's not taking us anywhere," Mick said. "We can't hike this stretch of river. We either keep going with the flow, or we try to make it back up river with one oar." "What's downriver?" I asked. "There's a village near the coast, but only if we make it past the falls," he replied. "And what kind of falls are we talking about?" I asked. 157-meter kind of falls," he answered. "I think we should try the oar." Mick stepped into the bow and plunked the oar into the water. Port, starboard, port, crunch. Brutus's giant jaws grabbed the oar and snapped it in half. Mick began yelling at Brutus, calling him some very unsavory names littered with some equally explicit adjectives. And that's when I noticed Brutus was bobbing on the surface, eyes blank, a pool of blood rapidly spreading around his still closed mouth. "Mick! Mick, look at him!" I said, grabbing Mick and shaking him. Tears of anger and sorrow rolled down his face as he blinked hard and focused on the still form of our once formidable foe. We pulled the body of the massive croc alongside our vessel. It was longer than it was and nearly half as wide. Now that we could see him, his cause of death was obvious. A broken piece of the oar had punctured his mouth and severed an artery. He had bled to death in seconds. "Maybe we should have stayed out of it," Mick said, slapping the body violently. "Maybe they'd both still be alive if we had." I didn't know what to say, so I said nothing at all. I just stood there in silence beside a man who was questioning his life's passion because of an accident. What else could I do? After a couple of minutes, I realized we still needed to get back upriver. With no oars and no motor, there really was no option that I could think of. This wasn't my place, and Mick just seemed so broken. I'd nearly resigned myself to taking on the challenge of the falls when all of a sudden we started moving against the current. I dove toward the bow, and there in the water before me, with a bit of rope grasped in his jaws, was the most glorious sight in all the world. Eric. And he was dragging us home. Eric didn't survive that fight unscathed. He lost one of his eyes, and there's a big chunk missing from his tail, but he's doing pretty great. I like to think that something I did that day saved him, but we all know who the real hero of this story is.